Welcome to the deep dive. We are taking on a subject today that, it completely reframes a massive structural piece of global history.
It really does.
Yeah, and I want to jump right in and throw a quote your way. It's from Field Marshal Sir Claude Auchinleck.
Right, the commander-in-chief.
Exactly, the commander-in-chief of the Indian Army in the 1940s. He's looking back at the first half of the 20th century, and he said, plainly and firmly, that the British simply couldn't have come through both World War I and II if they hadn't had the Indian Army.
Let that sit with you for a second.
Yeah.
We are talking about the two most devastating, world-altering conflicts in human history.
Uh-huh.
And a primary British military commander is explicitly stating that without this specific force, the outcome might have been entirely different.
It's a staggering assertion, and what's truly fascinating is how heavily the historical record and the raw data actually back it up.
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah.
Because when you think about the First World War, the collective cultural memory almost universally defaults to, the Western Front.
Right. We picture the muddy trenches in France.
The barbed wire, the localized stalemate between European powers. But that imagery captures only a fraction of the reality.
Just a fraction.
To actually understand the First World War, to grasp why it was a world war, you have to understand the immense, sprawling global reach of the Indian Army during this period.
They were fighting the German Empire.
They were fighting the Ottoman Empire.
And they were deployed to defend borders stretching from the fields of Flanders all the way to the coast of China.
Which is exactly the mission of this deep dive.
Right. We are taking a comprehensive, highly detailed organizational and historical breakdown of the Indian Army during World War I, and we're going to rescue this colossal contribution from the footnotes of history.
Because we are looking at a staggering 1.78 million men who served.
1.78 million.
And over 1 million of those men served overseas.
I want you to just imagine the sheer scale of that operation. Try to visualize the logistics of moving over 1 million people across the globe in the 1910s.
Right. There are no modern computers tracking shipments.
No jet aircraft moving troops in hours.
Well,
this is an era of steamships, of complex rail networks, physical ledgers, and a massive, lumbering organizational machine.
and we are going to hit some major aha moments today.
Oh, for sure.
Uncover stories of individual valor that will completely shift your perspective on the Great War.
But to understand how 1 million men were mobilized and shipped across the oceans, we first have to understand how this machine was actually built.
Right.
And that takes us to the reforms of Herbert Kitchener.
Yeah, Lord Kitchener is a foundational figure here.
In 1902.
Right. In 1902, he was appointed as the Commander-in-Chief, India, and he inherited a system that was, frankly, an archaic patchwork.
It was a mess.
Before Kitchener arrived, there was no singular Indian army in the way a modern military operates. There were 3 entirely separate armies belonging to the different presidencies.
Okay, let's unpack this.
Yeah.
Because running 3 separate parallel military organizations within the same territorial holding, that sounds like an absolute nightmare for command and control.
Oh, it is. You had the Bombay Army, the Madras Army, and the Bengal Army.
Right, and if you're preparing for modern industrialized warfare, how do you even coordinate logistics, let alone overarching strategy, when your forces are essentially divided into 3 regional silos?
You don't. And that was exactly Kitchener's realization.
Yeah.
It was a localized, fragmented system built for an older era of colonial policing, not for global power projection.
Yeah.
So Kitchener spent his tenure fundamentally dismantling that system.
He merged them.
Exactly. He merged those 3 separate presidency armies into one unified force. The regiments that had operated under the old system were stripped of their regional titles.
They're renumbered.
Renumbered in a single cohesive sequence. This new entity, combined with the British Army units permanently stationed in the country, fell under a unified command structure known as the Army of India.
And the implications of this were massive. Suddenly, a regiment raised in the South couldn't just sit comfortably in its home base for decades.
Right, they could be called upon to serve anywhere in the subcontinent.
A grueling tour of duty on the highly volatile northwest frontier became a standard, expected posting for every unit.
Which is crucial geographic mobility for training a cohesive fighting force.
But the actual organizational structure Kitchener put in place is where the underlying psychology of the empire really reveals itself.
Yes.
Kitchener split this newly unified force into 2 massive field armies. You had the Northern Army stretching all the way from the northwest frontier across to Bengal.
And the Southern Army.
Right, covering the territory from Baluchistan down to southern India. Between these two vast armies, there were 9 divisions,
9 divisions.
along with a few independent brigades. Each of those 9 divisions was comprised of 1 cavalry brigade and 3 infantry brigades. But this is where the composition gets highly specific.
Right, the integration role?
Exactly. The British administration enforced a remarkably strict integration rule across the board. There were never any all-British brigades.
And conversely, there were never any all-Indian brigades.
It was a hard rule. One British regiment or battalion had to be mixed into every single brigade formation.
And what's fascinating here is the sheer calculation behind that structure.
Right.
This wasn't a decision made for tactical battlefield efficiency. This was a structural safeguard, born directly out of the legacy of colonial control.
And imperial paranoia.
Exactly. The British administrators, remembering the uprisings of previous century, wanted an absolute guarantee that there was always a trusted, loyal, heavily armed British unit deeply embedded within any larger Indian formation.
It was a mechanism of internal security as much as it was a military organization.
Yes.
But wait, if the overarching goal at the brigade level was integration and oversight, why was the internal structure of the individual battalions so aggressively segregated? Because the numbers we have on the battalion makeup are incredibly complex.
They are.
A standard British infantry battalion at this time was roughly 1,000 men, 29 officers, and 977 other ranks.
Right.
But an Indian Army battalion was noticeably smaller. It had 30 officers, but only 723 men in the ranks.
And those 723 men were not just thrown together, they were divided with forensic precision.
That is the defining paradox of this army.
Yeah. At the macro level, the British integrated forces to maintain control. But at the micro level, within the companies of a single battalion, they enforced strict segregation.
Companies were often divided entirely by tribe, by caste, or by religion.
Right, so within one battalion, you might have one company composed entirely of Punjabi Muslims,
Another entirely of Sikhs.
and another of Hindu Rajputs. And commanding this intricate social web was a uniquely fractured officer corps.
Because of those 30 officers in an Indian battalion, only 17 were Indian.
The other 13 were expatriate British officers.
And those 13 British officers held the ultimate colonial authority.
Regardless of the battlefield experience or tenure of the Indian officers beneath them.
It's a hierarchy based purely on origin, not necessarily on merit or capability in the field.
Precisely. And the functional reality of this system required an immense amount of specialized knowledge from those 13 British officers.
Right.
To successfully command a segregated battalion, those officers had to spend years learning the specific languages and dialects of their men.
They had to deeply understand the tribal dynamics.
The religious dietary restrictions, the cultural taboos.
And the specific methods of motivation for each distinct company.
They were the linguistic and cultural bridges that held the entire combat unit together.
So what does this all mean when a mechanized global war suddenly breaks out? You have an army built on a highly delicate, hyper-specific balance of cultural knowledge concentrated in just 13 individuals per 1,000 men.
It means you have engineered a catastrophic single point of failure.
Yeah.
If those specific British officers are killed in combat, and officer casualty rates in the early months of the First World War were unprecedented,
They were massive.
the entire structure collapses. You cannot simply take a fresh British officer, newly graduated from Sandhurst, ship them to the front line, and drop them into an Indian battalion.
Because that new officer will not speak a word of the required languages.
Exactly. They will have zero understanding of the cultural nuances required to lead those specific men. The chain of communication, the trust, the operational cohesion, it all severs instantly.
That vulnerability is just waiting to be exposed.
It is.
But before we look at what happens when these battalions are deployed to the trenches of Europe, we have to look at the massive logistical and security apparatus required just to get them out of the country.
Right.
Because the subcontinent didn't just pause its own conflicts while the World War raged. The Indian Army had to maintain strict internal security and fiercely guard its own borders.
Particularly the northwest frontier against the constant threat of incursions from Afghanistan.
The defense of the home front remained an absolute strategic priority. The British could not afford to lose their grip on India while fighting in Europe.
Several entire divisions, the 1st Peshawar, the 2nd Rawalpindi, the 4th Quetta, they were kept stationed right there on the frontier.
And this wasn't mere paranoia. The threat of a secondary war opening up was incredibly real.
Oh, absolutely. By October of 1915, a joint Turco-German mission actually managed to arrive in Kabul.
which is a massive geopolitical maneuver. German and Ottoman agents traveling all the way to Kabul right in the middle of the war.
Their objective was to convince the Afghan factions to side with the Ottoman Sultan, declare war on the British Empire, and open up a massive new front right on India's doorstep.
If they had succeeded, the drain on British resources would have been catastrophic.
It would have fundamentally altered the Allied war strategy. They would have had to pull hundreds of thousands of troops away from Europe and the Middle East to fight a massive mountain war in Afghanistan.
Fortunately for the Allied powers, the Emir of Afghanistan, Habibullah Khan, recognized the immense danger of the situation.
He did. He managed to maintain his neutrality despite intense pressure from both the Turco-German mission and his own internal factions who wanted to strike while the British were distracted.
Even with the Emir holding the line on neutrality, the frontier was anything but peaceful. Localized fighting flared up constantly as various factions tried to take advantage of the global chaos.
Right. The Indian Army was actively engaged in heavy combat against the Tochi, the Momans, and the Kuki tribes.
So you have a fully active, lethal home front-running parallel to the largest overseas deployment in history.
Yeah.
And the sheer scale of the manpower mobilized to support this dual effort is difficult to wrap our head around. Before the war, the normal peacetime annual recruitment for the Indian Army was roughly 15,000 men.
Only 15,000.
By the time the war ended in 1918, nearly 1.3 million men had volunteered.
We are looking at over 800,000 active combatants and over 400,000 non-combatants mobilized.
The mobilization of human capital on that scale, drawing from agrarian societies and vastly different cultural backgrounds, is an organizational feat that rivals anything seen in the industrialized nations of Europe.
It does. But when you look at the raw data of this mobilization, you are also forced to confront the incredibly dark, grim realities of total war.
Yeah?
The records explicitly indicate that the recruitment standards became so desperate, the need to feed the war machine so absolute, that child soldiers as young as 10 years old were enlisted into the ranks.
10 years old. I just want to pause on that because when we discuss troop movements in the millions, it is so easy to let the numbers wash over you as abstract statistics.
Absolutely.
But a 10-year-old boy in a military uniform, it forces you to think about the physical reality. How does a child that age even carry the equipment, let alone endure the psychological horror of a global conflict?
It strips away any remaining veneer of romanticized military glory.
It really does. It leaves you staring at the brutal, unyielding desperation of an empire fighting for its very survival.
It is a profound indictment of the mechanics of the war. When an empire's survival is threatened, every societal norm, including the protection of children, is fed into the furnace.
It perfectly illustrates that the British High Command was pulling every conceivable lever to generate manpower.
And that manpower was required immediately, not just for the trenches of France, but for vital strategic resources that were suddenly under threat.
Right, because the very first deployments of the Indian Army overseas weren't driven by the defense of European soil.
Nope.
Here's where it gets really interesting. To understand the opening moves of the war in the Middle East, we have to rewind slightly to 1901.
Okay.
A massive geographical and economic discovery happens at a place called Masjid-i-Sulaiman, located at the head of the Persian Gulf. They strike commercial quantities of oil.
And by the time the global crisis erupts in 1914, the technological landscape of the British military has shifted.
The Royal Navy, the absolute backbone of British imperial power, was heavily transitioning from coal to oil.
Exactly. The privately owned Anglo-Persian oil company controlled these new concessions in the Gulf, and the British government was in the process of stepping in to essentially buy them out and guarantee this vital naval fuel supply.
So when the geopolitical situation deteriorates in August 1914, and it becomes terrifyingly clear that the Ottoman Turkish army is mobilizing and will likely ally with the German Empire, panic sets in at the highest levels of British command.
Because the fuel supply for the fleet that protects the home islands is suddenly sitting right next to a potentially hostile Ottoman army.
So they immediately instruct the Indian government to formulate a rapid contingency plan.
That contingency plan materializes as Indian Expeditionary Force D.
Force D.
By October 1914, under the command of Lieutenant General Sir Arthur Barrett, Force D set sail from Bombay and head straight for Bahrain.
Their primary overriding mission was not to engage the main Ottoman armies.
No.
It was to rapidly secure the oil fields and the refineries at Abadan to ensure the British fleet could keep moving.
If you look at the geopolitical map today, The legacy of that single deployment is astounding.
You are watching the absolute genesis of modern Middle Eastern geopolitics.
The scramble for oil, the strategic military intervention to secure petroleum assets, the redrawing of influence in the Persian Gulf.
It essentially all begins right there, with Force D sailing from Bombay in 1914.
It completely recontextualizes the outbreak of the war. The narrative is usually focused on the treaties protecting Belgium, but there was an equally pressing, absolutely vital strategic imperative to protect the fuel lines of the empire.
It is a shift from 19th century territorial warfare to 20th century resource warfare.
Absolute.
But while Force D is sailing to secure the oil, an immediate existential crisis is unfolding just across the English Channel.
Right.
The regular British Expeditionary Force that deployed to France in August 1914 is being ground down. They are taking massive, unsustainable casualties against the advancing German army.
They desperately need highly trained professional reinforcements, and they need them immediately.
This brings us to Expeditionary Force A, and the speed of this operation is incredible.
It is.
Just 6 weeks after the official declaration of war, by September 1914, 150,000 fully trained men of the Indian Army are arriving in Marseille, France.
The Indian government stripped its own garrisons to offer 2 cavalry divisions and 2 infantry divisions.
These were rapidly formed into the Indian Corps and the Indian Cavalry Corps, commanded by General Sir James Wilcox.
And they weren't given any time to acclimatize.
No!
They were thrust directly into some of the most brutal, chaotic early fighting of the Western Front.
We are talking about the desperate struggles to halt the German advance, the Ypres salient, the Battle of La Bassée in October 1914.
By March of 1915, at the Battle of Neuve-Chapelle, the 7th Meerut Division wasn't just supporting the line, they were actively leading the vanguard of the assault.
But the physical and logistical conditions they were thrown into were horrifying. Let's put ourselves in the shoes of an Indian sepoy arriving in France in late 1914. You have just spent weeks on a troop ship, traveling from the sweltering heat of the subcontinent. You disembark into the freezing, relentless mud and rain of continental Europe as winter sets in.
You're wearing cotton khaki uniforms, completely unsuited for freezing temperatures.
And then the logistical nightmare compounds. Upon arriving at the front, you are suddenly handed a brand new Lee Enfield rifle that you have absolutely zero familiarity with.
That weapon transition is a critical, often overlooked detail of combat effectiveness.
Right.
In a high-stress combat environment, muscle memory dictates survival. A soldier needs to be able to clear a jam, reload, and acquire a target in the dark under artillery fire purely by instinct.
If you take a highly trained soldier and suddenly issue them a new variant of a rifle with a different weight distribution,
A slightly different bolt-action mechanism.
and a new sight picture, their individual combat effectiveness plummets until they can retrain that muscle memory.
And they were trying to retrain while actively being shelled.
Furthermore, these Indian infantry divisions had been shipped over with practically zero heavy artillery of their own.
They were entirely dependent on neighboring British Corps for covering fire and artillery support, which requires immense coordination.
And then the exact nightmare scenario you highlighted earlier regarding the command structure becomes a reality.
Yes, the officer casualties on the Western Front were catastrophic.
The British officers who commanded the Indian battalions, the men who had spent years learning the dialects, understanding the specific religious dynamics,
The men who held the trust of those segregated companies.
they were killed or wounded in massive numbers during those first few months.
And when those officers fall, who is sent to replace them? They get replacement officers fresh from Britain who have never served in India
Who don't know the customs.
and who cannot speak a single word of Punjabi, Hindi, or Gurkhali. The linguistic bridge collapses.
A replacement officer is trying to issue complex tactical orders under heavy fire to a company of men who literally cannot understand what he's saying.
It creates a vacuum of leadership precisely when it is needed most. And this systemic failure was exacerbated by a deeply flawed reserve and replacement system for the enlisted men.
Right.
When an Indian battalion take heavy casualties, the replacements sent from the depots in France had absolutely no affiliation with the specific units they were dropped into.
Think about the psychological impact of that. You survive a horrific artillery barrage at Ypres, you lose half your company.
You lose the British officer who understood your culture.
And to fill the gaps in the line, headquarters shoves a group of totally strange replacements into your trench.
But because of the segregated nature of the army, these replacements might be from an entirely different region, speaking a different language, with completely different cultural customs.
The tight-knit cohesion of the battalion is shattered. Morale absolutely plummeted under these impossible conditions, and understandably so.
It was chaotic, deeply tragic deployment. But when we evaluate Force A, we must emphasize the strategic magnitude of what they achieved, despite facing overwhelming systemic handicaps.
Force A served as the Empire's crucial stopgap.
Exactly. The regular professional British Army had essentially been destroyed in the opening battles of 1914. Lord Kitchener was back in Britain, frantically trying to recruit and train a massive new volunteer army, the famous New Army.
But you cannot train millions of civilians overnight.
No. While Kitchener's New Army was spending months drilling in England, it was the Indian Army holding the line in the freezing mud of Flanders.
Ultimately, 130,000 Indian troops served in France and Belgium.
And nearly 9,000 of them died there.
Their sacrifice bought the British Empire the time it needed to survive. By October of 1915, the infantry divisions were finally withdrawn from the horrors of the Western Front and redirected to Mesopotamia.
The cavalry divisions, however, remained in Europe until 1918.
Fighting through the Somme and Cambrai, sometimes even being forced to abandon their horses and serve in the trenches as dismounted infantry.
Right.
So Europe was a brutal proving ground, characterized by mud and logistical failure. But the World War was simultaneously raging across the African continent.
Yes. And this brings us to Expeditionary Forces B and C, and a theater of operations defined almost entirely by staggering British arrogance and tactical hubris.
The campaigns in East Africa provide a masterclass in the dangers of underestimating your enemy. In late 1914, the colonial governor of British East Africa realized he was highly vulnerable to the German colonial forces operating across the border in German East Africa.
He requested urgent military assistance.
And the India office responded by organizing Force B and Force C. Force B was given the offensive mission.
Commanded by Major General Arthur Aitken.
Right. Force B was ordered to launch an amphibious invasion into German East Africa, targeting the coastal port city of Tonga in November 1914.
Aitken arrived off the coast with a formidable force of 9,000 troops. He was facing a German commander named Paul von Lettow-Vorbeck, who had assembled a defense force of only about 1,000 men.
9,000 attacking troops against a defending force of 1,000. On paper, it sounds like an inevitable steamroll. But the Battle of Tonga turned into one of the most complete and utter disasters in British military history.
General Aitken didn't bother with proper reconnaissance. He assumed the German colonial forces would simply flee at the sight of his massive army.
Instead, von Lettow-Vorbeck had his men deeply entrenched and waiting. The Indian troops were forced to disembark into dense mangrove swamps.
The tactical execution was completely botched. The supporting naval bombardment failed to neutralize the German positions.
As the Indian infantry struggled through the thick vegetation, they were cut to pieces by highly accurate, concentrated machine gun fire from the vastly outnumbered defenders.
And the local environment even turned against them. Angry swarms of wild bees, disturbed by the gunfire, viciously attacked the advancing troops.
Adding to the sheer chaos of the battlefield, Aitken's force was entirely routed. They were forced into a humiliating, disorganized retreat back to their transport ships, leaving everything behind.
Out of the 9,000 men deployed, they suffered 4,240 casualties against a force a fraction of their size.
They abandoned hundreds of rifles, 16 vital machine guns, and over 600,000 rounds of ammunition, which the German forces eagerly scooped up and used to sustain their guerrilla campaign for the rest of the war.
It was a catastrophic failure of leadership and a fatal assumption of European colonial superiority.
And tragically, we see the exact same pattern of poor intelligence and arrogance repeated with Force C at the Battle of Kilimanjaro.
Force C was initially designed as a defensive formation to guard the vital Uganda Railway.
But in October 1914, British command ordered a force of 4,000 men to advance toward the border.
Based on deeply flawed intelligence, the commanders believed they were facing a minor skirmish force of perhaps 200 Germans.
In reality, von Lettow-Vorbeck had concentrated over 600 heavily armed troops into strong, concealed defensive positions along their route.
The advancing troops, primarily consisting of 1,500 Punjabis, were ordered up the mountain slopes at night. As dawn broke and the morning fog rolled in, they walked straight into a meticulously planned ambush.
They were caught in a devastating crossfire. The troops fought incredibly bravely throughout the day, taking massive casualties, trying to dislodge an enemy they couldn't clearly see.
Meanwhile, a highly mobile German mounted patrol managed to loop around, ambush the British supply column, and stampede all of their water mules.
Leaving the pinned-down troops without hydration in the punishing heat. By nightfall, the British commanders realized the tactical situation was completely hopeless and were forced to order another humiliating retreat in the pitch dark.
These campaigns in the African bush highlight the wildly unpredictable, chaotic nature of this global conflict.
The Indian soldiers were paying the ultimate price for the doctrinal inflexibility of the British High Command.
They were fighting in alien, dense jungle environments, facing a master of guerrilla warfare, far removed from the static trench warfare doctrines being developed in Europe.
It feels like an endless series of localized disasters, but the scale of Tanga and Kilimanjaro pales in comparison to what was happening in the Middle East.
Right.
Which brings us to arguably the greatest sustained tragedy for the Indian Army during the entire war, the Mesopotamian campaign.
Remember Force D, the contingent sent to secure the oil fields in Bahrain and Abadan in 1914?
Their initial mission was highly successful, but then the scope of the operation expanded into a nightmare.
Mesopotamia, the region encompassing the Tigris and Euphrates rivers, became the single largest overseas deployment theater for the Indian Army.
Over the course of the war, nearly 700,000 men served in this specific operational theater.
After securing the oil, the command structure decided to push inland. Initially, the advance was intoxicatingly successful.
Under the command of Major General Charles Townshend, the forces moved up the river, securing Basra and steadily driving the Ottoman forces back.
Townshend won a series of brilliant tactical victories, and the lure of capturing Baghdad became an obsession for the high command.
But the deeper they pushed into Mesopotamia, the further they stretched their supply lines.
Townshend was advancing an army up a shallow, winding river through a barren desert, relying on a completely inadequate flotilla of riverboats to bring up food, ammunition, and medical supplies.
They were experiencing logistical overextension in its purest form. In November 1915, this overreach culminated in a massive, bloody setback at the Battle of Ctesiphon, just miles from Baghdad.
The Ottoman sources held the line, and Townshend, having taken severe casualties, was forced into a desperate retreat back down the Tigris.
He finally halted at a loop in the river at a city called Kut al-Amara, and instead of continuing the retreat to a defensible supply base, Townshend made the fateful, disastrous decision to stop, dig in, and hold the city.
By halting at Kut, Townshend allowed the pursuing Ottoman forces to completely encircle his army. This initiated the infamous Siege of Kut.
A protracted, agonizing standoff that lasted from December 1915 until April 1916.
While Townshend's men were trapped, the British command launched multiple, increasingly frantic military operations to break the siege.
Between January and March, relief forces threw themselves at the Ottoman trench lines downriver. At the Battle of Sheikh Sa'ad, the Wadi, the Hana Defile, and the Djizela Redoubt.
Every single one of these relief attempts failed catastrophically, resulting in immense casualties on both sides.
While the relief columns were bleeding themselves dry downriver, we have to look closely at the day-to-day reality inside Kut al-Amara.
You have thousands of men trapped in a small, crowded city, entirely surrounded by hostile artillery.
The desert climate is completely unforgiving, freezing at night, sweltering during the day. As the siege dragged on month after month, the food supplies plummeted.
The daily caloric intake for the soldiers was reduced to starvation levels.
And when you mix severe malnutrition with thousands of men trapped in unsanitary conditions, disease becomes the primary enemy. Incurable outbreaks of scurvy, dysentery, and cholera began sweeping through the garrison.
It is a slow, methodical degradation of human endurance.
The physical and psychological toll of watching the relief columns fail, while knowing the food is running out and disease is spreading unchecked, is unimaginable.
Finally, in late April 1916, with his men literally dying of starvation and no hope of rescue, Townshend was completely out of options. He surrendered the garrison to the Ottoman forces.
9,000 soldiers were marched into captivity. It remains one of the largest and most humiliating surrenders in the long history of the British military.
Now, the overarching Mesopotamian campaign did eventually find a brutal sort of redemption in 1917. A new commander, Frederick Stanley Maude, systematically rebuilt the logistics network and successfully captured Baghdad.
But we have to look at the holistic and horrifying toll of this specific theater.
The statistics from Mesopotamia demand our attention. 11,012 soldiers killed in action.
12,678 dead from disease.
A chilling figure that demonstrates the lethal reality of the environment and the complete collapse of medical logistics.
13,492 men listed as missing or taken prisoner, encompassing the massive loss at Kut.
And nearly 52,000 wounded.
The ratio of disease deaths to combat deaths is a stark indicator of just how hostile the theater was. Over 12,000 men dying not from enemy bullets, but from dysentery, cholera, and the sheer inability to maintain basic sanitation in the desert camps.
And this raises an absolutely critical point about how we remember the First World War.
Right.
The data unequivocally shows that the Mesopotamian campaign was predominantly an Indian campaign.
The presence of regular British units was minimal in comparison to the massive, sustained deployment of Indian troops.
It was the Indian Army that secured the vital oil reserves at the start of the war.
It was Indian soldiers who starved and suffered through the siege of Kut.
And it was overwhelmingly Indian forces that ultimately broke the Ottoman lines and captured Baghdad.
This theater alone should fundamentally alter our modern historical narrative. The Middle Eastern theater was not simply an extension of a European tragedy. It was an imperial catastrophe borne largely upon the shoulders of the Indian subcontinent.
That reframing is essential, and yet the operational geography of this army continues to expand outward.
The sheer volume of locations listed in these records is mind-blowing. Let's look at the deployments of Forces E, F, and G, and an incredibly obscure operation in China because it perfectly illustrates the sprawling web of the conflict.
If we trace Force F, we find them deployed to Egypt in 1914 with the specific strategic mandate to defend the Suez Canal from Ottoman incursions.
The Suez was the vital artery connecting Europe to the east, so its defense was paramount.
Force E arrived in Egypt later and became a major component of the expansive Sinai and Palestine campaign, driving the Ottoman forces north through the deserts.
By 1918, the forces in Palestine were heavily reinforced by two entire Indian cavalry divisions that had been transferred all the way from the muddy, static trenches of France.
The composition of these forces deployed to the Middle East brings such a vibrant, almost surreal visual element to the history.
Included in these deployments was the Imperial Service Cavalry Brigade. It sounds like something out of a 19th century romance, but these were elite, highly trained cavalry lancers provided by the wealthy princely states of Mysore, Hyderabad, and Jodhpur.
Try to visualize these highly decorated elite lancers executing mass cavalry charges across the arid deserts of Palestine against entrenched Ottoman artillery.
The operational records note stunning visuals. Fully equipped Indian cameleers navigating the dunes, Indian infantry acting as sentries guarding the sacred dome of the Rock in Jerusalem, and Indian cavalry regiments victoriously entering Damascus.
It is a profound total collision of vastly different worlds.
The imagery is incredibly striking, but we must balance that romantic image of desert cavalry with the grim, mechanized slaughter that awaited Force G.
Force G was assigned to the Gallipoli campaign, specifically the 29th Indian Infantry Brigade.
They arrived on the Turkish peninsula in April 1915 with the desperate task of reinforcing the British 29th Division, which had already been decimated in the opening amphibious landings.
Gallipoli is universally recognized as a tactical meat grinder, a campaign defined by sheer, unadulterated command incompetence.
And the Indian troops were thrown directly into the absolute worst sectors of the peninsula. The records highlight their involvement in the Third Battle of Krithia.
The 14th Firozpur Sikhs were given orders to advance directly up the floor of a heavily defended geographical feature known as Gully Ravine.
They were advancing into pre-sighted, concentrated Ottoman machine gun and artillery fire. They were practically wiped off the map in a single assault.
Out of a strength of 514 men, they suffered 380 casualties.
They lost 80% of their officer corps in a matter of hours.
The sheer discipline and psychological fortitude required to march forward into a ravine that is quite literally exploding around you is difficult to comprehend.
And even when these troops managed to achieve the impossible, they were plagued by tragedy. During the complex multi-pronged assault known as the Battle of Siri Bair, the 16th Gurkha Rifles executed a brilliant, incredibly difficult tactical maneuver.
Advancing under the cover of a coordinated naval bombardment, they fought their way up the steep, scrub-covered slopes and actually managed to capture the vital high ground of the hill.
It was a massive, desperately needed tactical victory that could have changed the momentum of the battle.
But the victory was instantly shattered because of a catastrophic breakdown in communication and targeting. The moment the Gurkhas took the peak, they were heavily shelled by their own supporting ships.
The Royal Navy poured high explosives directly onto the newly captured position, Friendly fire on a massive scale.
It is a devastating twist of fate. Having done the impossible and taken the objective, they are annihilated by their own side.
With casualties rapidly mounting from the naval bombardment, the command structure collapsed. The medical officer was forced to assume command of the surviving troops and had no choice but to order a complete withdrawal back down the hill.
Abandoning the very ground they had just bled to capture. It was a pointless, heartbreaking loss of life born out of sheer command friction.
By the time the Gallipoli campaign was abandoned, the 29th Brigade had suffered 1,358 dead and over 3,400 wounded.
And as if the shores of Turkey, the deserts of Iraq, the jungles of Africa, and the mud of France weren't a wide enough geographic spread, the Indian Army was also simultaneously fighting on the coast of East Asia.
The Siege of Qingdao is a fascinating, bizarre footnote in the global conflict. Qingdao was a heavily fortified port city in China controlled by the German Empire.
The Allied powers, primarily the British, were highly anxious about Japan's long-term imperial intentions in the Pacific region.
So, when Japan moved to besiege the German port, the British rapidly dispatched a small, highly symbolic military force to join the Japanese operation, essentially to plant the flag and keep a watchful eye on their allies.
The political maneuvering is intricate, and that symbolic British force included 500 soldiers from the 36th Sikhs.
So to summarize the sheer geopolitical absurdity of the year 1914, you have an infantry force of Indian soldiers, commanded by expatriate British officers, deployed to a port city in China, fighting alongside the Imperial Japanese military against the fortified forces of the German Empire.
The term World War almost feels inadequate to describe the sprawling complexity of these alliances and deployments.
It perfectly encapsulates the entangled, volatile web of global imperialism at the turn of the century.
But maintaining a global empire of this scale, relying so heavily on vast numbers of troops recruited from colonized populations to fight lethal wars on behalf of the colonizer, generates an immense amount of internal psychological, religious, and political strain.
And that immense structural strain violently snapped in February of 1915. We absolutely must discuss the 1915 Singapore Mutiny.
Yes.
And as we navigate this specific event, we are going to look strictly at the operational facts and the sequence of events provided in the historical record to understand the mechanics of what occurred.
The catalyst for the mutiny centers around a specific regiment, the 5th Light Infantry. This unit was composed of roughly equal numbers of Punjabi Muslims and Pathans.
In late 1914, they were deployed to the colony of Singapore. Their primary function was to serve as a garrison replacement for a regular British regiment that had been urgently redirected to the fighting in France.
However, the operational records clearly indicate that the morale within the 5th Light Infantry was critically low for a sustained period.
The regiment was plagued by a breakdown in internal communication, generally slack discipline, and notably weak, ineffective leadership from their British officers.
To compound the poor internal conditions, they were assigned a highly sensitive task: guarding German prisoners of war who had been captured from the SMS Emden, a famous German commerce raider.
The presence of these prisoners created a tense environment, and there is evidence to suggest active attempts were made to fan the existing discontent among the sepoys.
But the actual ignition point, the spark that detonated the powder keg, was a failure of communication regarding their next deployment.
The regiment was officially scheduled to be shipped out to Hong Kong for further garrison duty. But in the vacuum of clear communication from their leadership, rumors began spreading rapidly through the ranks that they were not going to Hong Kong, but were instead going to be shipped to the Middle East.
This raises an incredibly profound question, one that strikes at the very core of the imperial military model.
Right.
The enlisted men of the 5th Light Infantry were devout Muslims. The Ottoman Empire, which the British Empire was actively fighting in the Middle East, was the preeminent Islamic power of the era, ruled by a sultan who claimed the ultimate religious title of caliph.
The rampant rumors suggested that these men were being deployed to actively fight and kill their fellow Muslims on behalf of a Christian colonial power.
What happens to military discipline when a soldier's deep-seated fundamental religious identity is brought into direct, irreconcilable conflict with their imperial military orders?
It places the soldier in an absolutely impossible psychological bind. And because the weak leadership structure failed to transparently address or quash the rumor, the fear and resentment festered until it exploded.
On February 16, 1915, precisely as the regiment was making its final preparations to load out and depart, The four companies of Punjabi Muslims openly mutinied.
In the ensuing chaos, the four Pathan companies essentially scatter, refusing to join the mutiny but also breaking the chain of command. The situation instantly spiraled into total chaos.
The initial outbreak of violence was sudden and lethal. The mutineers killed two of their British officers right at the barracks.
They then mobilized toward the POW camp, where they engaged and killed 13 guards and other military personnel.
A fascinating historical detail is that the mutinying forces actively attempted to recruit the German prisoners of war to join their uprising against the British, but the Germans largely refused to participate.
For nearly 5 days, the fragmented groups of mutineers roamed the streets of Singapore, resulting in the tragic deaths of various European civilians and local personnel caught in the crossfire.
The British administration scrambled to contain the uprising. They eventually suppressed the mutiny by cobbling together an overwhelming force of local civilian volunteers, regular military units, heavily armed naval detachments pulled from Allied warships in the harbor.
And they even requested and received armed assistance from the Sultan of Johor.
Once the colonial authority was firmly reestablished, the retribution was swift, severe, and highly publicized.
Following a series of rapid courts-martial, 47 of the mutineers were publicly executed, 64 were sentenced to penal transportation for life, and 73 were given long prison sentences.
It remains a deeply complex, dark chapter of the war, but strategically, it exposes the extreme underlying fragility of the colonial military apparatus.
The British Empire relied fundamentally on these millions of men to fight their global wars, but the inherent simmering tensions of religious identity, colonial subjugation, and poor leadership could, and occasionally did, rupture violently.
As a postscript to the event, the surviving elements of the 5th Light Infantry who did not participate in the mutiny were subsequently redeployed to fight in the Harsh Cameron Campaign in West Africa and later saw action in East Africa and Aden.
The mutiny demonstrates the unbelievable psychological pressure cooker these men were operating within. They were balancing imperial demands, colonial hierarchy, and their own cultural identities.
Yet, despite the systemic inequalities, despite the prejudice of the era, and despite the staggering, horrifying casualty rates, the individual acts of bravery recorded by these soldiers are almost beyond belief.
We have to dive into the records of the Victoria Crosses.
To understand the significance here, we must note that the Victoria Cross is the highest, most prestigious award within the British honor system, granted exclusively for extreme valor in the presence of the enemy.
However, due to the structural prejudice of the empire, Indian soldiers were entirely ineligible to even receive the VC until 1911. Prior to that date, the highest award available to them was the Indian Order of Merit.
The sheer scale and vital necessity of their contribution in World War I finally forced that barrier down.
The historical records provide deeply specific, granular accounts of the actions that earned these medals. And discussing these individual narratives is absolutely vital because it cuts through the massive statistics we've been analyzing and humanizes the unimaginable grit of the men on the ground.
Let's look closely at the actions of Khudadad Khan, who holds the distinction of being the very first Indian recipient of the Victoria Cross.
The action took place on October 31st, 1914, at a location called Hollebek in Belgium during the desperate, freezing early days of the First Battle of Ypres.
He was serving as a sepoy in the 129th Duke of Connaught's own Baluchis. His unit was subjected to a massive, overwhelming German infantry assault supported by heavy artillery.
During the attack, the British officer commanding his specific detachment was severely wounded and incapacitated. A neighboring machine gun position was directly hit by an artillery shell, destroying the weapon and killing the crew.
Sepoy Khan was severely wounded by enemy fire. Despite his severe injuries, and despite being vastly outnumbered, he refused to fall back.
He remained at his machine gun, working the complex mechanism entirely alone under heavy fire, managing to keep the advancing enemy pinned down until every single one of the other 5 men in his gun detachment had been killed around him.
He single-handedly held that section of the line.
Just sheer, unyielding endurance in the face of absolute certain death. And then you have the narrative of Kulbir Thapa of the 3rd Gurkha Rifles, which reads like a surreal work of fiction.
This occurred in September 1915, during the brutal fighting in France. Thapa is wounded during an engagement. He manages to find a severely wounded British soldier from the Leicestershire Regiment.
But here is the critical geographical detail. He finds this British soldier trapped behind the first line of the German trench network. He is entirely cut off, operating behind enemy lines.
The British soldier, knowing the situation is hopeless, actively urges Tapa to save himself and leave him behind.
But Tapa flatly refuses. He stays hidden with the wounded man throughout the entire day and the freezing night.
The following morning, utilizing the thick mist for cover, he manages to drag the British soldier through the dense German barbed wire network to an area of comparative safety.
But the operation doesn't end there.
Not even close. Having secured the British soldier, Tapa goes back through the wire into enemy territory.
He locates two severely wounded Gurkhas from his own unit and physically brings them out one after the other, navigating the battlefield under the threat of discovery.
And then in broad daylight, fully exposed to enemy observation and fire, he goes back into the danger zone a fourth consecutive time to retrieve the British soldier he had initially hidden, carrying him the rest of the way back to the safety of the Allied lines.
It defies every basic human survival instinct.
It is a stunning demonstration of physical stamina, but more importantly, it highlights an unbreakable, deeply ingrained code of personal and regimental honor.
Let's analyze the account of Lance Dafadar Gobind Singh of the 28th Light Cavalry.
In late 1917, fighting in France, his cavalry brigade found itself completely cut off from the main force, surrounded and pinned down by heavy enemy fire.
To coordinate a rescue or artillery support, they needed to physically run messages between their isolated position and brigade headquarters. Gobind Singh volunteered for this task.
The distance he had to cover was 1.5 miles across completely open ground, devoid of cover, under intense concentrated artillery barrages and sweeping machine gun fire.
I want to emphasize that distance. 1.5 miles of open ground. And he doesn't just do it once. He volunteers and runs that gauntlet 3 separate times.
He successfully delivered the vital intelligence on every single run, but the most staggering detail of his citation is that on every single one of those 3 journeys, the horse he was riding was shot out from under him by enemy fire.
Yet every time his mount was killed, he untangled himself from the fall and forced himself to finish the run on foot, sprinting through the mud and the incoming fire.
His mere survival is a statistical anomaly. His sustained bravery over hours of exposure is absolute.
I want to highlight one final citation because of the profound humanity embedded in the action. Lance Naik Lala of the 41st Dagres.
This takes place in the punishing environment of Mesopotamia in January 1916.
During an engagement, he spots a British officer lying severely wounded, completely exposed close to the enemy lines. Lala breaks cover, drags the officer into a temporary shallow shelter, and manages to bandage his wounds.
While treating him, he hears his own adjutant calling out in pain. The adjutant is lying wounded in the open, merely 100 yards from the entrenched enemy positions.
Lala insists on leaving the shelter to rescue him. But before he steps back out into the line of fire, he strips off his own uniform clothing and carefully wraps it around the first wounded officer to ensure he doesn't freeze in the harsh desert environment.
He literally, physically gives the shirt off his back to protect another man before stepping back into lethal danger.
Exactly. He crawls out, stays with his badly wounded adjutant until the sun goes down and darkness provides some cover, returns to the shelter to carry the first officer all the way back to the safety of their lines, grabs a medical stretcher, goes back out into the darkness, and successfully retrieves his adjutant.
Consider the profound paradox here. These men were deployed thousands of miles from their homes, enduring unimaginable physical suffering, fighting on behalf of a global empire that actively ruled over, segregated, and politically suppressed them.
And yet, amidst the darkest horrors of industrialized warfare, they continuously displayed a level of humanity, loyalty, and sheer courage that leaves you completely in awe.
It is a profound historical paradox. And it is precisely that paradox, that massive collision of loyalty, sacrifice, and colonial reality, that makes the aftermath of the First World War so incredibly poignant and historically significant.
When the guns finally mercifully fell silent in November of 1918, the geopolitical landscape of the world was permanently altered, and the Indian Army itself was fundamentally changed by the experience.
By 1919, due to the massive recruitment drives, the Army had ballooned to an unprecedented size of 491,000 men.
But they were facing a critical systemic crisis, an absolute shortage of experienced leadership because so many of their veteran officers had been slaughtered in the trenches of Europe, the jungles of Africa, and the deserts of the Middle East.
The records show that the 1920s were characterized by a massive, rapid downsizing and structural reorganization.
The British government quickly realized It simply could not financially maintain this massive wartime military apparatus during peacetime.
By 1925, the army in India had been aggressively slashed down to roughly 197,000 troops.
The grand cavalry regiments, which had charged through Palestine and suffered in the mud of the Somme, were heavily reduced from 39 regiments down to just 21.
The infantry battalions were consolidated into 20 large, overarching regiments.
The operational focus shifted sharply back inward, returning to internal security policing and the perpetual task of guarding that highly volatile northwest frontier. Because the reality for the Indian Army is that the fighting never actually stopped.
Immediately after the armistice in Europe, they were plunged into the Third Afghan War in 1919, followed by grueling, continuous counterinsurgency campaigns in Waziristan throughout the 1920s and 1930s.
The machinery of the empire continued to grind onward, but the catastrophic loss of human life could not be ignored or swept away.
The historical consensus is that at least 74,187 Indian soldiers died during the First World War, with tens of thousands more permanently wounded or missing.
To commemorate this monumental global sacrifice, the British commissioned the construction of the India Gate in New Delhi, which was officially unveiled in 1931. It stands today as a towering architectural monument, inscribed with the names of the dead.
As we conclude this deep dive, I want to bring the focus directly back to you, the listener.
If you ever come across a photograph of the India Gate, or if you ever have the privilege of standing in its shadow in New Delhi, I want you to look at it through the lens of everything we've uncovered today.
Do not just see it as a static piece of imperial stone architecture. See it as a tangible testament to a staggering, truly global sacrifice.
Consider the immense geography of that sacrifice. The names carved into that stone represent men who fought and died in the freezing, gas-choked mud of Flanders.
They represent the men who suffered through the sweltering, disease-ridden sieges of Mesopotamia.
They fought in the blinding mangrove swamps of East Africa, the rocky, lethal ravines of Gallipoli, and the distant coastal ports of China.
They secured the critical petroleum reserves that physically fueled the transition to the modern world, and they held the defensive line in Europe when the British Empire was on the absolute brink of military collapse.
Their contribution to the 20th century wasn't secondary, and it wasn't a footnote. It was entirely foundational.
It truly was foundational.
And I want to leave you with one final provocative thought to mull over as we end this journey. Something that builds naturally out of the massive geopolitical shifts we've just discussed.
Think deeply about the psychological impact of this mobilization.
Over 1 million Indian men left their agrarian homes, crossed the great oceans, and fought shoulder to shoulder with and against the most powerful European nations on Earth.
They saw the industrialized world through the horrific lens of a devastating modern war.
More importantly, they saw the profound vulnerability of their colonial masters. They watched British forces fail at Gallipoli. They saw British commanders surrender at Kut. They bled the exact same red blood in the trenches of France.
When those hundreds of thousands of surviving veterans finally returned home to an India that was still firmly locked under colonial rule, returning armed with new, expansive global perspectives, highly advanced military training, and the acute, undeniable knowledge of exactly how much they had sacrificed to save the empire.
How could the British ever possibly expect the social hierarchy to go back to the way it was? Consider how this unprecedented global mobilization, this massive collision of cultures, conflict, and shared suffering, might have quietly but irrevocably planted the seeds for the massive independence movements that would very soon sweep across the entire nation. Thank you so much for joining us on this exploration. We will catch you on the next deep dive.